the opening scene, we are introduced to a Seattle police officer named Edward Malice, who is patrolling the highway on his bike. During this, a doll falls out of a running car in front of him. Being the good cop that he is, Edward picks up the doll, using his Ghost Rider Riz, and approaches the car to return it. Unfortunately, as soon as he hands it to the owner, she throws it back again.
What are you doing, kid?
And when he goes to retrieve the doll, a truck suddenly crashes into the car, causing it to burst into flames. Edward quickly rushes to their aid, but the car explodes, throwing him away. The scene then cuts to a few days later, where we see Edward on leave as he is still haunted by the tragic accident. He constantly has the hallucinations of the same event, which disturbs his mental health. As a result of this, he is prescribed some medicine. One day, he receives a letter from his ex-fiancée, Willow Woodward, informing him that her daughter, Rowan, has gone missing. So, she wants his help in finding the little girl. Edward thinks about it for a while, as he had been betrayed and hurt numerous times by Willow in the past. But still, he decides to assist her in finding her daughter. The very next day, Edward boards a seaplane.
Ahoy there,
he says to the captain like a jackass. He travels to an island off the coast of Washington state where Willow resides. The island appears to be inhabited by a group of neo-pagans, led by an elderly woman named Sister Summersisle, whom the residents worship as a goddess. The village is predominantly populated by women, and men are treated as slaves. Edward is dropped off at the coast, from where he begins walking toward the village. Along the way, he encounters a group of villagers, to whom he inquires about Rowan, but they evade his questions. He also notices two women carrying a large bag with blood-like liquid dripping from it. He asks them about the same, but in response, they only make fun of him. After a while of walking, Edward arrives at a rural motel where he declares himself as a police officer and announces that he is here to investigate the missing child case. In the midst of this, Edward kills a bee on the table, causing everyone to stare at him with anger. Little does he know that bee honey is the main exporter product of the village. So the villagers perform a fertility ritual every year for growing crops and honey. Shortly after, Willow enters the motel and shows him to his room. Later that day, Edward and Willow have a secret meeting in the woods. She expresses her gratitude to Edward for agreeing to help and warns him that the villagers will attempt to deceive him. She then requests him to have faith in her because she is confident that Rowan is captured and hidden somewhere in the village. After hearing all this, Edward assures her that he will do everything in his power to locate her daughter. The same night, while Edward is asleep, he has a dream involving the girl from the previous accident. This jolts him awake, prompting him to take his medication. At that moment, he notices a girl who resembles Rowan running outside the motel. Edward quickly rushes out and follows her to a barn. Inside, he searches the entire place thoroughly, but only finds the girl's red jacket. While on his quest, he steps on a weak wooden plank, which causes him to almost fall into the basement. He's dangling like,
whoa, whoa, whoa.
The following day, Edward visits the village school, where he meets a teacher named Sister Rose, who is in the middle of a class. He interrupts the class and inquires about Rowan. However, everyone feigns ignorance regarding her whereabouts. Suspecting that they are hiding something, Edward retrieves the class register without Sister Rose's permission and examines the student names. To his surprise, he discovers Rowan's name crossed out. Edward opens a desk to see if she's inside, but a bird pops out, and Edward goes,
"Hey!"
In response, Sister Rose insists on speaking with Edward outside. After a brief conversation about the islanders' perspective on death, she reveals that Rowan is no longer alive. Edward asks about the cause of her death, and Rose replies, "She'll burn to death." When Edward catches the tense she used, Rose quickly corrects herself by saying she burned to death. In addition, she informs Edward that the child has been buried in the churchyard. In the next scene, Edward makes his way to the churchyard, where he is approached by Willow. She asserts with conviction that Rowan is still alive, and the villagers, under Sister Summersisle's command, have taken her away and are trying to harm her. In a shocking turn of events, Willow also reveals that Rowan's biological father is none other than Edward.
Dad? What do you mean? What do you mean?
After this, she leads him to Rowan's room, recounting the last time she saw her daughter at her study desk. On that fateful day, Willow had stepped out for a mere half hour, and by the time she returned, Rowan, as well as all her belongings, were mysteriously gone. Edward inquires if there are any other photographs of the child, but Willow responds in the negative. Shortly after, as Edward is investigating the room, he hears the sound of a seaplane, prompting him to hurry outside in hopes of using its radio to contact his colleagues in Seattle for assistance. Beside the seaplane, Edward calls out to the pilot, but his calls go unanswered. At the same time, he spots the lifeless body of a young girl floating in the water. Believing it to be Rowan, he impulsively dives in and retrieves the body. However, in a sudden moment of clarity, he realizes it was a hallucination. Edward then realizes that he has forgotten to take his medication, so he swiftly retrieves the bottle from his pocket and consumes it. Following this, he swims towards the seaplane to access its radio, only to discover that it is not functioning. As Edward returns empty-handed, he comes across the house of Dr. T.H. Moss, a physician and photographer in the village. He knocks on the door, hoping to find a picture of the missing child. However, just like the others, Dr. Moss pretends to know nothing about it. Edward, who is well aware of the deception, acts as if he is leaving, but instead conceals himself behind a bush outside. After a short while, two women wearing face masks arrive at Dr. Moss's door and take him along with them. Once they depart, Edward breaks into the house and thoroughly searches every room. During his exploration, he uncovers evidence of a ritual involving human sacrifice, which the villagers appear to believe in. On investigating further, Edward finds several glass beakers containing male human embryos. Shocked and confused, Edward goes to Willow and inquires about the ritual, but even she lacks sufficient knowledge about it. With this, Edward decides to visit the senior-most person on the island, Sister Summersisle. As he makes his way towards her, he comes across some men loading wood onto a cart. Edward generously lends a hand and attempts to strike up a conversation, but the men don't utter a word. It seems that they are forbidden from engaging in any conversation, as a pair of masked women vigilantly monitor their every move. Undeterred, Edward continues on his journey, lost in his own thoughts.
These women are crazy.
However, his preoccupation leads to an unfortunate mishap as he accidentally collides with one of the beehives in the vicinity. Instantly, a swarm of angry bees surrounds him. Edward attempts to run away from them, but only ends up tumbling down a steep hill, knocking himself out. After some time, he opens his eyes and realizes that he is now in Sister Summersisle's place. He then finally meets with her in the garden and begins to question her about the events happening in the village. Sister Summersisle explains to Edward that her ancestors fled England to escape persecution and then settled on this island. She also states that their population is predominantly female, as they chose the strongest stock. The island's economy relies on the production of local honey, but Edward learns that its production has recently declined. Out of the blue, he asks if they have murdered Rowan, to which she responds that they don't murder anyone, but sacrifice them to the gods. This angers Edward, who argues that human sacrifice is also a form of murder. In order to confirm whether the missing kid is truly dead, Edward decides to exhume the grave. As he does so, he surprisingly discovers that the coffin contains only a burnt doll, indicating that Rowan is still alive. Just then, Edward hears a crying voice coming from an underground bunker, prompting him to follow the sound. As he descends, he discovers an entrance leading to an underground water tank. Inside the water, he finds Rowan's distinctive red jacket. Alarmed, Edward frantically opens the lid and dives into the water, but someone from behind locks the lid, trapping him in the tank. Edward desperately calls for help, but his cries go unheard. The night passes, and Edward remains clinging to the lid of the tank. Thankfully, early the next morning, Willow spots him and frees him from the trap. Edward then shows her Rowan's red jacket and doll as evidence that she was held captive here. Not long after, Edward becomes aware that today is the May Day festival on the island, and the villagers are preparing to perform a fertility ritual. This realization fills him with panic, as he believes that they are about to sacrifice Rowan. As a result, he urges Willow to stay at home safely, while he searches the entire village for their daughter. He even visits a local coffee shop and seeks assistance from the male villagers, but they completely disregard him. Left with no other option, Edward goes to Sister Beach, who works at the same motel he stayed at. He, incapacitates her, steals her bear costume, and joins the parade led by Sister Summersisle, blending in as one of the island's inhabitants. Before long, Edward notices that Rowan is tied to a large tree, seemingly destined for sacrifice. Without wasting any time, he rescues her bravely and then escapes into the woods. The shot of Nick Cage punching a lady dressed as a bear is the clip that initially made me fall in love with YouTube. After fleeing for some time, Edward appears to be lost, so Rowan leads the way. Shockingly, she leads him back to Sister Summersisle, and the kid reunites with her mother, who stands alongside the so-called goddess. In a shocking twist, Sister Summersisle thanks Rowan for her assistance, and Edward realizes that the search for Rowan was a premeditated trap the whole time. It is then unveiled that Willow, known on the island as Sister Willow, is none other than Sister Summersile's daughter. She had orchestrated Edward's fate years ago by choosing him as a human sacrifice in order to restore the island's cursed honey production. This revelation devastates Edward as he once again experiences betrayal from his former fiancée. Following this, the villagers gradually encircle Edward, closing in on him. He brings out his gun, threatening to shoot all of them, but Willow reveals that she has removed all the bullets from his weapon. The villagers then tackle and overpower Edward, cruelly breaking his legs to ensure he cannot escape. They also subject him to extreme torment by releasing the bees upon him. If you've ever watched me on Twitch, you know I goddamn love this scene. A few moments later, they carry him to an enormous doll, which they refer to as the Wicker Man, where he is hoisted high above the ground and locked inside. With Willow's consent, Rowan ignites the Wicker Man, and Edward is sacrificed in a colossal inferno, all as his screams echo through the air.
Killing me won't bring back your goddamn honey! Ah! Ah! Ah!
The scene then shifts to 6 months later, depicting Sister Willow and Sister Honey in a bar within Washington. There, they are approached by 2 police officers, one of whom recently graduated from the police academy. The women invite them to their home, presumably to entice them to the island, just like they did to Edward. James Franco is about to get into almost as much trouble as he did in real life. Subscribe for more videos like this, turn on notifications, and leave a like to help the channel out. Thank you for watching.